as I was explaining to Roy, like my job is to help students learn how to learn more efficiently. And I love my job. And the reason that I'm doing this wonderful presentation slash discussion about e-portfolios is because, as it says on the board, I hate portfolios. Okay. No, I've done a couple of portfolios. My background is in teaching. It's in English, it's in history, it's in basically all of those things that require you to show that you know what you're doing by showing it and being able to discuss it. So what I'm going to do with this presentation, I'm going to be talking about how to make the case with students about portfolios and a little bit about how you might design a portfolio system that will encourage students learning instead of kind of demotivating them. So I guess we start with the complaints. These are the most common ones that you see / hear. I don't see the value in it. It seems like busy work. I'm too focused on the product and not on the process. Too much work, not enough time. I don't know what you want. I don't know how to do this. And then the biggest one is no one will ever look at it anyway. And one of my wonderful jobs in the past was I actually was a editor of a literary zine, and someone did a wonderful job of putting this into a poem. You probably can't read it, but it says 101/100 practical uses for a high school portfolio. And the reason that they put this together is the high school that I went to did freshman year. You come in and you get this assignment that's called the high school portfolio, and at the end of 4 years, you were supposed to have created this wonderful document that is a portfolio that you will take with you into your future life. What ended up happening is we worked on it during homeroom for the first year. The second year we worked on it once. At the end of the year we had to just turn everything in. The third year they got shoved in a box in the back closet of the English department's offices. And then the last year when we were supposed to be presenting them to our authentic audience, they changed their minds and decided they didn't want to do portfolios anymore. So we never actually did anything, which was good because no one had actually built the portfolio to begin with. It became a kind of a running joke. So some of the things you see on here: doorstop, pooper scooper, ironing board. Somebody says traction for stuck tires. I'm from Michigan, so that's possible. But the number 101 thing here says organized set of work to show prospective employers, wait, we want practical uses. So this is where students are coming from. Low motivation, lack of understanding why, high time constraints, lack of confidence, and the lack of reflective ability. Right? They're used to being graded on the product, not on the process. So how do you change that mentality? How do you change that culture? So, some ideas. Okay, portfolios, and particularly e-portfolios, should be both formative and summative. So they should be showing the development of the student and also showing the outcome of the learning. With an e-portfolio, they're easy to edit, they're easy to update, they're searchable. So if a student has put something there, they can find it later. It has a social aspect to it, particularly the web-based ones, like WordPress, like Google Sites, where they can share it with peers and they can have it follow them or go with them. And it also helps teach technology skills, and those skills are directly transferable into the workforce. I never understood when I was in high school and even when I was in college that there might be a situation where I'm asked to edit a website. My first year when I was starting out, someone said, hey, can you go and change this thing on the website? And I said, what? Okay. But because I had done e-portfolios and things like that, I said, yeah, sure, go on and do it. So teaching them the technology and teaching them how to organize their materials, organize their life, they can then take that system that they develop in undergrad and use it to hopefully make sense of the working world. Okay. So there was a study. Have any of you read the Becta study? It's like 118 pages, so that's okay. There's a link to it in the I have references. But what they said is that e-portfolios make progress and attainment more obvious to teachers and students because viewing and revisiting the repository of work reveals development, achievement, strengths, and weaknesses. But what they did here is they went to a bunch of schools, both the K through 12 and also colleges, and this is based in the UK, so they were actually mostly colleges. And they said, okay, what's working, why is it working? Show us your best stuff, show us your worst. What they found is that students find that portfolios have five basic functions. Storage, so we put the stuff there and we can find it there later. Information management, that we can find it, we know where it is. Connections to the material, being able to revisit those pieces and say, oh, you know, I did a paper my freshman year about XYZ, and now I'm having to do that again in my senior year. Let me go and look at my source list, or let me go and look at my materials. To communicate to others, and then for development purposes. However, this is what it turns into when you are teaching. So it goes from, this is what the students think the functions of a portfolio, e-portfolio are, to this. So what is this? Basically, it's showing a balanced portfolio system. This is the portfolio as a story. So assessment for learning, and this is the portfolio as a test or an assessment of learning. And what most of the research is saying is that we really need both sides. We need to have that reflection of learning and also that assessment of learning. So I'm not going to read this all to you, but that's something to keep in mind as you're thinking about how can we use portfolios. Can we take that learning experience and make it both reflective and assess what is being learned? So, isn't this fun and messy looking?
But you know, this does a great job of capturing something that some of the other PIs and I are concerned about, and that is the conceptualization of this whole project doesn't seem to quite capture the different dimensions that are up there, because you know the most immediate motivation for this whole ePortfolio project is that upper left-hand corner, that the portfolio becomes a gateway to use an instrument for assessing competencies. And you know, when you think about it, really the fact that this kind of comes down from the Board of Governors, you can understand why they would take that perspective, because they're less familiar with this whole idea of it being a different way for students to express their learning. I mean, that's just not their world. But that's, yeah, I mean, that really nails it, I think.
Now, what I would point out as well is that you see how these are numbered, 1, 2, and 3? That might be a good way to start the process. So you start with it being an archive. Then you move from the archive into a management system. Then you move from the management system into the presentation system, or the what did I learn. So this is just a kind of a fun, creative way of doing it. I will say that the more that the portfolio leans toward the story, the more motivated the students are.
And that was our concern too, I think, in the fact that it's diminishing returns in terms of the whole portfolio model if it's objectified as this singular entity of, you know, accountability for the student, assessment for the faculty member. You know, ultimately, I think it's that right side that where the true qualitative value lies, right? And so I don't know that these are so dichotomous after all. I think it's representational of the two different perspectives on what e-portfolios can do. Well, I think we'd need to figure out, you know, is how they can converge, you know, in a positive way.
And hopefully, I've got some ideas, but just getting the ball, I mean, I'm sure you guys are thinking about this and the ball is already rolling down the hill. But I just thought this was just the perfect graphic.
Oh, it definitely is.
To show that kind of crazy world of being above a portfolio. Okay. So some strategies to try to get students motivated. Number one, the class has to be built around the portfolio. This cannot be something that at the end of the semester you go, oh, by the way, you have to do a portfolio. So it has to be introduced on day one. You have to give the story on day one. So what is the narrative? Why are you choosing to do a portfolio? It's not just for a grade. What are you expecting them to get out of it? How do you expect them to use it? You also have to show examples. I have some examples that I'm going to show you. I've got some really great examples. I've got some really terrible examples. One thing that you might try doing is having an example of your own portfolio. So how would you develop a portfolio of your competencies as a faculty member? Can you show them what that looks like? I have a portfolio that I've been working on that I'm building around my CV. So I just start with that. Here's my CV. Let me show what I did with that, or let me show what I did with this. So I'm adding in links and pictures and videos of things that I've done.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would you mind, or do you think that students would mind if we used like a sample student portfolio? Because my concern was that I didn't want them to feel overwhelmed with a professional portfolio versus something that was more academic at first, because these are, for me, they would be entry-level students. So do you think that having kind of a model portfolio as a student portfolio would be a good option as well?
I think that for as far as examples, that having kind of a baseline, this was a good portfolio student sample, but also having this is what it can become, an awesome example or an innovative example, and then also this is what we don't want to see. And that don't want to see would probably be something that you would make as a fake student, because you don't want to use somebody's work as a bad example ever. But yeah, I think that using student work is really important, but also getting them seeing it as a professional tool, not as just a thing I'm doing for this class.
Okay, got it.
So yes, use student examples, but also use you.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to have clear competencies and guidelines, and recognize the difference between competency and guideline. So a good place to start with those are things that might come out of this this little piloty thing. I guess I'll call that it. Also, student learning outcomes. What do you expect them to know? I work with students every single day. They come in and they bring me their syllabi, and I look at those syllabi with them, and I say, oh, so what are you expected to learn in your calculus class? And they say, calculus. And I said, what does it say in your syllabus? Where the assignments are and when they're due? So then I get to sit down and have that conversation about what are the learning outcomes? How will you know when you've done this? And just spending time going, these are the things you will be able to do. If you don't know what this means now, that's a really good thing, because that means that you have a lot of room for growth. And then the guidelines for the portfolio, and I have some suggestions there too. Also, to increase student motivation, there has to be a lot of flexibility, a lot of choice. And I'll talk more about how to build that flexibility in a little while. And then, of course, the organizational piece, like we were talking with this, you're not going to see a freshman English major put something together like this. The organizational skills just usually aren't developed in high school enough to organize. So you're going to have to help them develop that structure. Whether you give them the structure or you help them build it themselves, teaching them not to wait until the day before it's due to pull out all of these things that they've done all semester. You've got to get them organizing it as they go. Okay. Love pictures. So e-portfolios mimic the way that we learn. So this is my hypothetical learner. Actually, this is me as a learner. And you can see I have this expertise circle. I'm pretty good in English. I'm okay in Spanish. You see my calculus circle is barely touching. Okay. U.S. history, world history. Okay, so this is me, and our job as faculty members and as instructors is to make this inner circle bigger and to push these smaller circles closer to the center. So this looks an awful lot like a sitemap for a website, doesn't it? So this is going to be a lot better to get them to think about how their learning becomes than page 1, competency 1, page 2, competency 2, in that standard linear paper model. There's a reason why I have this, by the way. When I show the portfolio examples, that's fun. Anyway. Okay, so let's make our e-portfolios mimic what our learners look like. All right. Tagging is really great. If you're using a website-based portfolio, give them the tags you want them to use. How many of our students are on Twitter? Like 98% of them.
Instagram also.
Okay. They're used to hashtags. Give them tags. Okay. Say, when you're doing your work, here are some things I want you to think about. How would you categorize this? When you're asking them to reflect, go ahead and say, at the bottom of your reflection essay, put your hashtags. Where might this fit? And it's going to make it easier for them to search for it later. Also have them reflect along. When you have them do a project or a presentation, or you have them do a speech or a paper or even a test, give them a set of questions and say, I want you to post on a blog or a wiki about one of these questions for everything that you turn in. And then they can pick the questions so they have that flexibility, but you're giving them the guidance. Okay? So maybe they have an assignment that they really struggled with. Great. Get them to say, this is how I struggled with it. Maybe they have an assignment that they did really, really innovative things with. Good. They should say how they're thinking about it now. Because at the end of the semester, they're not going to remember how they struggled. They're only going to remember, I got a C on that. And that's not really innovative. Okay. And then also have others respond to those prompts. Have it be something that becomes the class culture. Okay. Particularly, this collaborative thing is really important in classes where the students are stretched. And a lot of the gen eds, we find that to be the case. So I would say that should definitely be something that you make part of the reflective process. Okay. Have you guys seen this before?
Oh,
Yeah, I was sure that you have. The reflection cycle, doing this stuff with the tagging and the reflecting as you go along gets rid of the first half of the circle for you already. So it gets them doing some of the not selecting, but it gets them doing some of the describing and analyzing as they go. And then when they start putting together the bigger pieces of the portfolio and how they're going to structure it, how they're going to build it, the appraisal will be a lot easier to do in deciding what to put in. And it will become more about that process and less about that product. Now, if you don't like the reflection cycle, there is a business-based similar reflection cycle. It's called the continuous process improvement phase. So it's basically the same thing. So you analyze, you design or determine what needs to be improved or what is needed to improve. You develop a plan, you execute the plan, you evaluate the results. So particularly in some of those tech or business type classes, this might be a better fit for what they're doing. And I have links to all of this stuff in this, so you'll have it. Okay. How many people in here are salesmen? No one. You? Excellent. What do you sell?
Well, I used to sell cars.
Excellent. So you are going to be really spot on with this, because cars are hard to sell. Yeah. So you have to sell the portfolio. You have to be excited about it. You have to be assured of its value. And I think that's one of the things you're going to struggle with getting this to be something you do across gen ed, is you've got to get everybody to love it. You have to tell the story of why. You have to give suggestions. Like, you know what, the minimum you'll have to do for this is X, Y, Z. But I've seen some people do some really, really great things with A and B. And I think it would be a good fit for you to look at this. Okay. Stress resources. I put the DACT studio. I know A&T probably doesn't have a DACT studio. Maybe you do. It's digital acts. So we have this at UNCG.
Yeah, they don't, although their teaching and learning support, the Academy of Teaching and Learning. I always want to make sure I get the full title when it stops in there.
ATL.
Yeah, but the Academy of Teaching and Learning has some analogous types of support that they're a little bit closer to our DMC, to our Digital Media Center. But they do have a support network there.
Yeah. So the Digital Act Studio that we have at UNCG is based around the idea of technology and rhetoric. So it helps students with things like, this is a really terrible example, but like, is that font or theme a good fit for this presentation? You know, is a blog a good fit to get this information across? Or would it look better if you did it as a video? Or if you did a video, how do you use that video? Where do you put it? How do you share it? So something like that, or knowing that they can come to you and ask you questions about how do I make this look. You also will need an authentic audience. The audience cannot just be the faculty member, or else the students will say, I already showed you all of this work. Why do I have to show you all of this work again? You've already seen it. And you won't get some really authentic responses. And I've got a really good example of that too, because I did one of those, why am I showing this to you again, portfolios. Okay. And then linking course content and experiences across the curriculum. So you should be encouraging them to add things to their portfolio that they didn't do in your class. Because they can still show their competencies and they can still show their growth, even if it's not an assignment. As far as audiences, having people who will be their audience and having them know that person will get them to produce better product. So if they know that there's going to be a group of people in their major who wants to see their work, or someone from industry, or a mentor who wants to be able to show this information to a potential contact or network. Even it could be their LinkedIn community, just to give them something to write for or to design for. Again, you want to show that assessment piece. How are you going to assess the process? How are you going to assess the product? And those being two separate things. Are you going to use a rubric? Will they get to grade themselves? Will their peers grade their work? Will there be a mentor? How will you know when a competency has been attained? How are you going to structure that? I'm not an expert in doing that, so you'll have to have someone else talk about how to do that. Okay. And then I would also stress not requiring any particular artifact. A lot of times students push back against that, and I'm sure you've seen that maybe in some of your classes, where you say, I want you to put this in your portfolio. Everybody has to put this artifact in your portfolio, and everyone says, okay, and then they don't actually reflect about it. So the idea would be to give suggestions or to make comments about how this would be a good representation, and getting them started thinking about why they would choose that, or why they would choose that C+ product over that A+ product to show that same competency. Some examples. So I have these pulled up already. I guess I'll start with the one that's the paper one. So I have my master's in education at UNCG, and we had to do a portfolio. And at the time, we were not doing an e-portfolio. So this is task string. We weren't doing an e-portfolio. It was a paper portfolio for your master's work, e-portfolio for your undergraduate work. And they had very strict rules. It had to be in a 3-ring binder. It had to have a cover sheet. It had to have page numbers. It had to have table of contents. This basic, if you don't say it's required, it won't happen. And so when I turned in my portfolio, it's a 3-ring binder with a cover sheet with copies of the competencies for all of my committee members. And then a CD with my actual portfolio on it. Because I don't think linearly, so I stopped thinking linearly and just did what I needed to do. So what I ended up doing is I made a portfolio. And I began by saying this is different, but this is why I did it. And then I gave an introduction to the format because my committee would have no idea what this was because they'd never seen it before. But then, at the end, I said, orient yourself to this because it's not meant to be observed page 1, page 2, page 3. Go to the sitemap if you get lost.
No, that's cute.
So, kind of a jerk, but my committee really liked this. They could go to the table of contents. They could view all of the pieces in order if they wanted to. Or they could start with my artifacts, organized chronologically, and say, oh, okay, this is competency C. But also, I think I've got a couple of them that used more than one. So instead of having to make 3, 4, 5, 6 copies of everything I wanted to use more than once, I could just use it once. I can look at pictures, presentation, materials. I have a video in here of me actually teaching. Like one of the competencies that I had to prove was that I know how to teach. So I videotaped myself teaching and put it inside my portfolio. Okay. So these are things that, I kind of just said, I want to be able to show these things, let me show you them. And I did a lot of work with, you'll see like lots of like kid stuff. I did a lot of work with second language learners who were immigrants from all over the place. But so you'll see a lot of work like that. There's my video. There's a video, the assignment, and the pieces. And then you can also go and read about what is the expertise, what are you expecting me to know, how did I conceptualize that, how did I analyze it. Okay, so this is your typical essay, right? But, also got things like this. So, you want me to show you that I can do this? Let me show you. So this is one way that you can do it. Now, I'm kind of, I would not think that an incoming student would be able to produce this. This is where I'm talking about sometimes you show them really great examples, but you don't expect them to be able to produce this right away. So this might be something like that they aspire to. And I even say in my sitemap, I included this so that you'll know how I did this. But it was important to me to have this idea of how the pieces would fit together. And I would encourage others to put the pieces together first. Okay. This started with something that looked more like this. So your early 1990s web page with, there's no blinking lights, but, the buttons that aren't matching and the random links and things that stop working after time. So this, and I will say both of these examples, they look like websites, but none of them, they've never ever been hosted on the internet. They're just files that you open with a web browser. So that's the other thing. You can have students build websites without having to have web space. Okay. So this was a portfolio that I started to show that I can do technology. And I've got organized here my NETS standards, my National Education Technology Standards. And then of course you can click on the links and it will take you to the site. I've got my resume, all that other stuff, so on and so on. So this is much more clunky, okay, but it still has that web feel of this is not just page one. You can click around, you can explore a little bit. And then this was built on a portfolio that started out looking like this. And so what I did is I built this, and then I took this and I embedded it into the next one. And then I took that and I embedded it into the next one. And so what I ended up doing is I made my web bigger and bigger, and I started connecting, here's this Myers-Briggs assessment, let me connect that to those educational technology standards. Okay, and how does that play out? So I think that's definitely something that, as you're thinking about doing like a big, everybody does a portfolio, can you have them start with this is your portfolio, and then this is your bigger portfolio, and adding on to it, and seeing those connections and how things fit together. All right, so this is a website based, and you could do this in WordPress. Particularly if you do WordPress, you can do like clouds, so you can have tag clouds that hang out. I'm sure you guys have seen those because you've messed around with WordPress a little bit. So if you're giving them the tags, you can have it accessible that way too. A lot less work that way than doing all of these links and things. Okay, questions so far? I've been talking a long time. Okay, so this is much clunkier than this, which is much clunkier than this. But now I have 3 examples of portfolios, and I can talk about my development as somebody who designs portfolios. Okay. Task stream, on the other hand, is just clunky all the time. So I'm going to put my vote against task stream, because this is someone's task stream covering the same types of competencies as the other ones that I just showed you. And it's just a paper portfolio that has been put onto a website. It's not getting at that web idea. It's not getting on that interconnectedness idea. It's just, I don't want to have to print this out, so I'll do it in TaskStream. Okay. And then there's also the standard. Okay, I found this online. This is from LaGuardia Community College. This is a student's portfolio. It's the same basic idea. This would be a basic example of what a student could do. And then they can link this to their own professional network. Okay, so fun stuff. Oh, this is my website. Okay, and then the other thing that I wanted to get you guys thinking about was this idea of arcs. Have you heard of the ARCS model? Anybody? Maybe a long time ago. Maybe a little fuzzy, maybe not. It's a model that was designed / researched in the 80s, so it's a little bit older. But it stands for attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. And these are the 4 things that faculty members need to get a student to have sustained motivation. And one of the things that I do with my students when I'm meeting with them, and they're struggling in their coursework, and they're saying, I really want to do well, but it's just really hard to do the work, or to put the time in, or to make the choice. We actually will graph out, okay, so what's keeping your attention? Why is this relevant? How well do you think you can do this? How satisfied are you with the result? How proud are you of the result? How authentic is this task for you? And so we'll actually identify where their weakness is, which category they're struggling in, and then use that to create ideas about how to get them more motivated. But as a faculty member, you can think about this: how do you get them motivated to do their portfolio well? So ARCS is something kind of cool to think about. And I'll send this to Roy. I almost called you Ray. It's my stepdad's name. I have kind of like a question activity list about each of the levels. So attention can be gathered through perception or through inquiry. How do you build perception and inquiry into your lessons? So on and so on. So I'll send this to you too, something to think about. And then I also have tons of little resources too. So with this, the Own ePortfolio WordPress is absolutely amazing. So they have like a getting started guide for students. They have a getting started guide for faculty on developing ePortfolios in a class. They've got videos, and they've got sample menu items, and they actually encourage faculty members to set the criteria for the portfolio, and then take that criteria, get rid of most of it, but just keep the titles, and give the student the title. So you say that the competency is critical thinking. You might give them a document that lists a million different ways to demonstrate critical thinking. Or you just give them the idea of critical thinking and ask them to discover it on their own. And they just have to put that right label on it. And so then you're developing critical thinking about critical thinking. It's like, oh my God. Okay. So you can also use something like Evernote to start putting things together to build your portfolio. I use OneNote all the time at home. It's similar. And this is a blog about a teacher who uses Evernote in his classrooms and how he does it. I've also got Code Academy for learning how to build a website. This would be a really great resource for students if they're learning WordPress or they're doing some sort of web-based or kind of browser-based portfolio, because it teaches them step by step how do you like change the color of a font, or how do you make a web page, and how to do site maps. Because these are things that the students are going to have to need to know how to do, even if you don't go with a website-based portfolio. They're still going to have to be able to organize things electronically. And I have a lot of students who can't even organize their flash drives, let alone organize their work. And so then you take this idea of building a site map as a starting place for their portfolio. So this is you conceptualizing the web, regardless of how it looks when it's finished. How will the pieces fit together? How will you add things to it as you go along? So I thought that was really a neat thing to put in there. And then the second page is all the fancy studies and lengthy research, so on and such, that you can read on your own, because I'm not going to read all of that for you. Okay, so what do we get out of this?
Oh, that wasn't a rhetorical question. Okay.
No, that wasn't.
You know,
Wasn't at all.
one of the, it's kind of a technical thing that's an implication of what you pointed out. This issue of how striking this balance between maximizing student opportunities for creativity, and for self-organization, but at the same time, just for the practical purposes of evaluation of your own sanity, providing enough structure in the guidelines to give an organizational template, if nothing else. From what it seems to me, in what we've seen so far from things like Digication, TaskStream, and even Google Sites, if you choose that e-portfolio option for templates, one thing that helps with is it does give at least kind of a structural standard for the e-portfolios. And it actually probably cuts down a lot of the kind of mechanical tasks you're going to have to do with the students early on. Of course, the downside of that is that would cut into the usability beyond the specific context of a course or say a capstone requirement or whatever. It's almost like you've always got these trade-offs with these various e-portfolio platform options.
Well, one of the things that I would ask you to consider is, if you're building a university-wide portfolio, okay, can you build this in a ring for the student and then ask them to grow it? So can you say, this is you, here are the competencies that we want you to get from your education. Where are you going to put the pieces? And so then you're giving them those categories, and even just the categories themselves are going to help with the assessment. Because then you can look and you can say, gosh, this person is pretty heavy on web design, but not so much with products and services. This is a terrible example, but you get the point. Okay, so when we're trying to develop this student, this is where we need to focus for this student. But another student looking at their web, it might be somewhere else, where they've maybe not taken the right set of courses, or in those courses not developed the right set of competencies.
I think in response to your question, and what Royce mentioned here as well, we could see this and disaggregate what, those individual competencies are and how much. But ideally, in selecting the platform, we want the student also to have opportunities to connect those competencies, right?
Mhm.
So it isn't merely, as you suggested, test stream is a repository,
Right.
or depository in that case.
Right. So how do you get them to make these connections from this
Yes,
to here,
correct.
or from this to here and then across to there? So, their internal web is even going to be crazier than this. But if you start them out with a little bit of structure, and that's why I like tags better than folders, even in my email, because you
Because
can.
what I think is going to happen with our pilot is not this, because we're modeling them in basically courses, individual
Yeah.
courses is where they'll be situated. And ultimately, it seems that our criteria for assessing is the portfolio itself, not so much, now that's up to the instructor, individual components within it, but as far as what we're interested in, right, is the portfolio as a whole, as opposed to, disaggregating all the individual parts of it,
Right.
which the instructor will do if for the grade for the course, right, but,
Yeah.
so in other words, it's complex and wonderful is what e-portfolio's potentials are, which I very much understand, particularly as far as, the growth of the student across his or her tenure here or wherever. In our much more isolated instance for this pilot, ideally, these should be run fairly simply, fairly efficiently. You see, and this is what I think is we're begging for this notion of, encouraging creativity, yet within a certain paradigm. You know what I mean? That does establish some commonality, not only within a section, but even across our sections that we're piloting. So with those considerations in mind, what are characteristics of portfolio platforms that you would look for?
I would look for something that is more than just a collection place. So I would avoid, I hate saying I would avoid, but I would avoid anything that just seems like a task stream. I hate to pick on task stream, but I would look for something that has the capability to start off small and to get bigger. Which is why, I lean more toward the web-based, because you can link things together, and you can link things together across the board. I think even within the scope of doing just one class and having this portfolio be the way that you assess that class, you're still going to get at these common ideas. And so then it might be, how do we get a platform that can be specific enough for this course, but also flexible enough to give the students some buy-in?
Because this is one of the, actually touches on several of the concerns Monday, in terms of portability as well. Where in our situation, we're kind of screwed, right? We have individual instructors picking individual platforms.
Right.
So instructor A uses Digication, instructor B is using, Google Sites. Then there's the instance, of course, of the material. And I said that, of course, the habits of mind that go into the construction of it transfers hopefully. But then there's always the orientation to a new technology.
Well, and the problem with, and again, talking about creating, the structure for the student is you don't teach them how to make a structure. And so they're always going to be looking for, okay, we're going from task stream to digitation, or to just, I can't even say that word, or we're going from this to that. Now, what's the structure of this? Because I'm not going to learn it, because it's changed. And if I didn't need to know what I learned in the last platform, I'm not going to want to learn what I need to in the new platform. So having something where if you go from one system to the next, how do you get them to understand how to create the structure instead of just saying, here's the structure to use?
But these are outlying concerns.
Yeah.
All we're worried about is this semester's coursework.
Yeah.
But the idea, and of course, in terms of general administration, I think what they're thinking, moving forward, right, how what we found will impact decisions going forward for perhaps university-wide adoption of platforms and stuff, for university portfolio, in which all these things would be important to consider. But we won't get at that necessarily.
No, not really. And I think you're right. I mean, some of these issues that they're asking, in fact, you're going to be getting a Qualtrics survey very, 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 very soon, like no later than tomorrow morning, which is the list of the questions that they want me to answer Tuesday. And I actually have to construct my PowerPoint and answers and everything for Monday. But they're asking things like, well, what would it take to bring an e-portfolio system to scale on campus? And the answer to that is it's not just a matter of a quantitative expansion.
Right.
An e-portfolio becomes something different once it crosses different courses, different aspects of the curriculum. I mean, a good example that we're going to hear about in a later session down the road is what about the role of e-portfolios in documenting experiences beyond the classroom? This is where we're going to hear from our career services folks. They've been working on these co-curricular e-portfolios. Well, I mean, those are the sorts of issues that are important, but quite frankly, you can't get to them through these kinds of projects. So I think the big issue here is what kinds of things happen to the way we approach instruction, with the introduction of e-portfolios in our courses, and what sorts of things happen to the student learning experience. Does it actually make it easier to access evidence of student learning in these areas, or does that become a much more complicated procedure, that we may say, well, it gives us more information, but more information is not always better.
Right.
That is one beauty of standardized tests. You get a unified score, and that's the index as to where a student stands. Now, what you do with that, who knows? But there is this issue about the just the practicality of doing it, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why Shawn's comment about the peer review aspect and self-review aspect, aside from that just being a good pedagogical tool, you may find that that's absolutely necessary for these things to function in your courses, because if you were evaluating yourself every single stage of the process, I don't know how you're going to get through evaluating all of these things in a timely fashion so students can use your feedback. And in fact, you had mentioned that this is one of the things that Clemson encountered in their university-wide implementation. And they wound up doing a tremendous amount of peer review that actually is part of the formal assessment process there. So oddly enough, it almost resembles something like a MOOC in the way that a lot of the evaluation goes, where your peers assess your own work. I may be wrong, but I have a feeling that if that's the direction this starts to go, the Board of Governors will find the concept of e-portfolios far less appealing than they do now.
No, absolutely.
But if you think about it, in the real world, your peers evaluate you consistently and constantly
Sure.
in every aspect of your work. Peer review journal,
Yeah.
So then it's how do you teach students how to
Right.
evaluate others?
Right.
And then in the process of learning that, can they learn to evaluate themselves? And then if they're evaluating themselves, then what is your role as the instructor?
Yeah, this is one of the impetus, I think, behind Bogus Slip.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, lots of questions.
I'm out of
Yeah, well, that's fine. We have our departmental graduation coming up in half an hour, so.
Yeah. Well, right. Well, Shawn, thank you.
Yeah.
Very much.
Thanks.